You know, when your deep dive request landed in my inbox with American Hitler in the title, I have to admit my eyebrows shot up.
Yeah.
Ken Levi's book definitely doesn't pull any punches. He even claims some Trump supporters would die for him. So we're diving deep into some intense territory today, trying to understand the unwavering loyalty of Trump's base.
It's a question that goes beyond the surface-level controversies. Levi really wants to unpack why so many people were drawn to Trump and what kept them so loyal, even when things got really heated.
Okay, let's unpack this. The book throws around a pretty loaded term, cult. It even draws parallels between Trump and Jim Jones, the Jonestown tragedy. Before we even get into that comparison, can you give us a working definition of a cult? Because it's a word thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
That's a great place to start because you're right, cult gets tossed around in casual conversation. But when we're talking about the psychology and sociology of a group, we need to be precise. A cult typically centers around a charismatic leader who demands unquestioning obedience and devotion. They often have their own unique set of beliefs that can be quite different from mainstream views.
Okay, so there's this core element of unwavering belief in the leader and their ideology. Now, Levi argues that Trump and his movement share some of these cult-like characteristics. One example that really jumped out at me was the demonization of anyone who disagreed with Trump, even respected figures.
Right, and the book points to Dr. Fauci as a prime example. Here's a guy who's dedicated his life to public health, advising presidents for decades, yet simply for disagreeing with Trump's COVID response, he was met with threats, even calls for violence.
It's scary, really. It's like any dissenting voice, any criticism was instantly labeled as an attack, and the people around Trump were expected to fall in line.
And that's a tactic we see repeatedly with cult leaders. They create a system where questioning or criticizing is akin to betrayal. It's about maintaining absolute control over the narrative.
Which brings us to another parallel the book draws, how Trump supporters justified his actions, even when those actions seemed, well, questionable at best. The January 6th attack on the Capitol really exemplifies this.
Absolutely. Levi argues that many Trump supporters genuinely believed the election was stolen and saw the attack not as an assault on democracy, but as a patriotic act, a defense of their way of life. And this kind of unquestioning justification, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, is another hallmark of cult-like behavior.
It's like they were in a completely different reality, fueled by Trump's constant claims of fake news and his attacks on any media that dared to question him.
Exactly. It's about controlling the flow of information. If you tell your followers that only you are telling the truth and everyone else is lying, you create an environment where people are primed to dismiss anything that contradicts your narrative.
It's giving me chills just thinking about it. It's one thing to disagree politically, but to completely write off huge chunks of reality because they don't fit the narrative, that's a whole other level.
And that's where the book's comparison to cults gets really unsettling, because it forces us to ask, how much of this was about genuine belief versus being swept up in a powerful, all-encompassing narrative?
It's a huge question. And speaking of huge questions, we haven't even touched on why people were drawn to Trump in the first place. The book calls this the invitational edge. What exactly does that mean? And what factors were at play here?
It's like this. Imagine the invitational edge as the open door that allows someone to step into a new way of thinking. Levi argues that there were three key factors that made people receptive to Trump's message in the first place.
Okay, so let's talk about those factors. What drew people to step through that door?
The first factor is receptivity. Imagine a group of people who are already feeling disillusioned, let down by the political establishment.
Right, like they've lost faith in the system.
Exactly. Many of Trump's supporters came from this traditional Republican base, feeling like the American dream was slipping away.
They wanted someone to blame.
Yes, and they were primed for a message that resonated with their frustration, someone to acknowledge their anger, their fear. And Trump, with his, well, let's be honest, his no-holds-barred rhetoric.
He was the guy who wasn't afraid to say what some people were thinking, but felt like they couldn't say.
Right. Trump tapped into those raw emotions. He wasn't afraid to point fingers and name names, which brings us to dislocation.
That rural-urban divide the book talks about.
Exactly. Levi argues that many in rural communities felt increasingly alienated, ignored by the media, misunderstood.
Like their voices weren't being heard.
Yes. They felt like their values were under attack, their way of life was fading. And then comes Trump. the billionaire businessman, but presenting himself as a champion of the forgotten man.
The ultimate outsider.
Exactly. He positioned himself as the one person who understood their struggles, their resentments,
Yeah.
their deep-seated fear that America was slipping away. And this leads us to charisma.
Okay, say what you will about the guy, but Trump definitely has that it factor. He could work a crowd like nobody else.
Absolutely. Love him or hate him, you can't deny his magnetism.
Yep.
A master showman. Like him or not, he knew how to play to his audience.
He was loud, he was brash, he made promises,
Yeah.
and people were drawn to that. It was like he was giving them permission to embrace their anger, their frustrations.
And that's a powerful feeling, that validation. It's like finding your tribe, a group of people who share your values and beliefs. And once that bond is formed,
It's hard to break, even if you see things differently later on.
it can be incredibly difficult, even in the face of contradictory evidence. And that's where we start to see those cult-like dynamics take hold, like in Jonestown.
Which it's terrifying. What were those social mechanisms that kept people trapped, loyal, even when things went so wrong?
One of the most powerful was the constant reinforcement of an us versus them mentality.
Creating an enemy.
Exactly. Trump's rhetoric was all about drawing lines in the sand. His supporters were locked in a constant battle against a corrupt elite, the deep state, the liberal media.
You're either with us or against us.
It's a tale as old as time, really. Create an enemy, make people fear that enemy, and then position yourself as their only savior.
Divide and conquer. Classic.
Yeah.
And then you add in the echo chambers.
Right. Think about the physical isolation of many rural communities. Now, layer on top of that, the rise of social media.
Everyone's in their own little bubble.
Exactly. And those bubbles are filled with information that confirms their existing biases.
It's like, have you ever noticed yourself getting caught in an online echo chamber, even unintentionally? I know I have.
It's something we all have to be mindful of. It's easy to get swept up in a world where everyone agrees with you, but it creates this false sense of consensus.
And critical thinking goes out the window.
Exactly. And it's in that fertile ground where critical thinking is suspended that those cult-like behaviors can take root.
So we've got the U.S. versus them narrative, the echo chambers. What else was going on to solidify this intense loyalty?
Symbols, rituals, shared experiences. Think about the Mad J hats, the rallies, the chants. They created a sense of belonging, a shared identity, a sense of being part of something bigger than yourself.
It's like being part of a team. You wear the colors, you chant the chants.
And that bond can be incredibly strong, especially when it's reinforced by a constant stream of messages that tell you that you're part of a special group fighting for the future of your country.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
But what about when reality starts to contradict the narrative? Like, how did Trump's most devoted followers rationalize his contradictions?
That's where cognitive dissonance comes in. It describes the mental discomfort we experience when we hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time.
So, like, I believe Trump is a good person versus Trump is being accused of doing some pretty shady stuff.
Exactly. And to resolve that dissonance, people tend to do one of two things: change their beliefs or rationalize the contradiction.
And in Trump's case, many of his supporters chose to rationalize.
That's what Levi argues. He suggests that rather than abandoning their deeply held beliefs about Trump, they doubled down, dismissing any negative information as fake news, minimizing his flaws, or even celebrating his most outrageous behavior as proof that he was a fighter.
Wow. Our brains are capable of some serious mental gymnastics.
It's a fascinating and often disturbing aspect of human psychology, and it's one of the reasons why cults can be so difficult to break free from.
Okay, so we've talked about the social pressures, the echo chambers, the cognitive dissonance. But what about the individual psychology?
That's where things get really interesting. Levi argues that Trump's appeal went beyond just political ideology or social dynamics. He believes Trump tapped into a deeper psychological need for recognition, belonging, and what he calls the status self.
The status self. What does that even mean?
It's that deep-seated part of us that craves respect. Acknowledgement, a place in the social hierarchy. Levi argues that both Trump and many of his followers felt a sense of, well, he uses the term narcissistic injury.
Narcissistic injury. Okay. Gotta admit, not a term I hear every day. Break it down for us. What does that even look like, in everyday life?
Think of it as that feeling of being overlooked, disrespected, or even straight up humiliated.
Ouch.
Right. It's a blow to the ego, and it can trigger a powerful need to reclaim your sense of worth, to prove you're important, that you deserve to be seen, heard.
And Trump was incredibly good at tapping into that, telling his supporters they were the real Americans, the silent majority, the ones who'd been wronged, forgotten by the elites.
Exactly. He gave them an enemy to blame for their problems. The liberals, the immigrants, the media, and he positioned himself as their champion, the one person who could restore them to their rightful place.
So it wasn't just about economics or politics, but really tapping into emotions, people's deepest insecurities, desires, and then offering them a simple solution.
And that kind of message, it can be incredibly alluring, especially in times of uncertainty, upheaval, when people are looking for someone to blame, someone to lead them.
It's a lot to unpack. We've talked about the social and psychological factors that contributed to the Trump phenomenon, the parallels to cult behavior, the dangers of propaganda, echo chambers. Where do we go from here? What does it all mean?
That's the million-dollar question. Levi's warning is something we really need to take seriously, because the forces that allowed Trump to rise to power, that economic anxiety, the social divisions, the erosion of trust, it hasn't gone away.
So it's not just about Trump himself, but the conditions that made his rise possible. And those are still very much present.
Unfortunately, yes. And as long as those conditions exist, there will be those who seek to exploit them. But, and this is important, Levi doesn't just leave us with a sense of doom and gloom. He argues that by understanding these dynamics, by being aware of the tactics used to manipulate us, we can become more resilient.
So knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these things work, the less likely we are to be taken in.
Like learning how a magic trick works. Once you see the strings, it's not so impressive anymore.
I like that. But it's not just about individual awareness, right? What can we do as a society to address these deeper issues, to create a more just world where fewer people are susceptible?
That's the big question, and there's no easy answer. But it starts with honest conversations about the challenges we face, the things that divide us, finding ways to build empathy, understanding, even when it's difficult.
Definitely easier said than done, especially now when everything feels so polarized.
It's a challenge for sure, but also an opportunity. We're living in a time of immense change, technological, social. We have the tools to connect with each other, share information, build communities across those divides. The question is, will we use those tools to further divide us or to create a more just and equitable world?
It's something to think about, that's for sure. And it's a question that I think Levi's book really forces us to confront.
It does. It's a challenging read, but a necessary one. If as one thing I hope our listeners take away from our deep dive, it's the importance of engaging with these issues, being critical thinkers.
Because at the end of the day, our democracy depends on it.
Couldn't said it better myself.
This has been an intense, eye-opening deep dive. We've all learned a lot. If you want to keep exploring, I highly recommend checking out Ken Levi's American Hitler. As always, thanks for diving deep with us. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the world around us, the better equipped we are to navigate its complexities and create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.